All events happen in space and in time. And that's what makes physics so wonderful.
Lawrence needs no introduction, but that's not going to stop me from giving him one. So we have here with us today Professor Lawrence Krauss, cosmologist, physicist, somewhere there, yeah, and founder of the Origins Project. Are you ready to speak, Lawrence? Are you ready to speak for us?
Probably. Hello, thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you. It was nice to meet many of you when I wandered in here a few minutes ago, and it's nice to see some old friends who are here to share this. And it's just great to be here. I really appreciate you coming, and I really appreciate John coordinating this. As he pointed out, I think I heard in the back when I was trying to get my machine set up that yeah. So this is my foundation has co-sponsored this, but basically John's done all the work with his people, and we just helped out a little bit. And so it's great. I hope we'll have a lovely day. In fact, it's such a nice day, we really should go outside instead of being here. But I put this, now, it'd be really neat if this light came off, but probably you can't control it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I put the poem up. Holy mackerel, okay, good, you can see it. Because I was originally getting Richard to read it because he's so good at reciting poetry. But it's one of my favorite poems from T.S. Eliot, from the War Quartets, about time. I'm going to talk, as we think about new ways of thinking about the world, which I think is what this is all about. I am going to be talking about my new book, which in the United Kingdom is called The Known Unknowns, and in the United States is called The Edge of Knowledge. This is because of political correctness. Because The Known Unknowns is a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, and my American publishers decided it was inappropriate to have a quote from Donald Rumsfeld on the cover of the book. But I like The Edge of Knowledge too. They're both the same thing, what we know we don't know about the universe, because that's really what gets science going, as I'll talk about at the end of the talk as well. It's really at the heart of what all of you are about too. The fact that we're happy to say we don't know. And that's what makes life worth living in some sense. So I thought I'd pick two topics from the book, from the beginning of the book and the end of the book to talk about. So let's see if you can click forward, if there's anyone there can click forward enough. One of the other quotes I begin the book with is one of my favorite quotes from Richard Feynman, who said, "I don't feel frightened not knowing things by being lost in a mysterious universe without any purpose, which is the way it really is as far as I can tell." And that's the motto. That's always been my motto. And the motto of people, I think, who are willing to not have a fairy in the sky taking care of them. The fact that it's mysterious and it's our job to kind of figure out as much as we can about how the universe works. So next slide. Keep pressing. Okay. Time, which I don't have enough of apparently. Okay, keep going. So I have quotes at the beginning of each chapter about time, but this is one of my favorite ones from Kurt Vonnegut, who happens to be another one of my favorite authors. "Here we are, Mr. Pilgrim, trapped in the amber of this moment. There is no why. For many people, including physicists, time may be an illusion. And some physicists actually think time is an illusion. I'm a kind of very basic physicists, and for me that means absolutely nothing, because what's really important is operational things. Time may be an illusion in some vast sense, but the question is, how does that illusion arise? And while it may be an illusion, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, there we go. I just came in on the train, which was running, which was a great success, because I didn't come in yesterday, because it wouldn't have been running. But this is in Switzerland, where the trains always run. And time may be an illusion, but when I used to, I lived in Switzerland for a little while and wrote one of my books there, actually. And before my iWatch and iPhone, you really could tell the time by the trains. I lived right beside the subway station, and I knew if I was 1 minute late, the train wouldn't be there. So I was able to tell the time by the clocks. And in fact, if you are 1 minute late for a train and you miss it and don't get to work, if I tell you time is an illusion, it's not much solace, right? And so time is an amazing part of our existence, but physics has completely changed the picture of time and made it even more mysterious than it was before. I mean, all of us suffer with the fact that time inexorably moves forward in our lives until it stops for us, but continues for other people. And that alone seems to be a tragedy, although in some sense it's just wonderful that we have that brief moment to enjoy that period. But a person who did look, if you can look at the next slide, click once, there we go. This is another famous clock. This is in Bern, Switzerland. And this is probably close to the view that Albert Einstein had when he was working in the Swiss Patent Office and thinking and developing his special theory of relativity. And it's not surprising, given where he lived and worked, that he thought about it and tried to explain it using trains, and by the way, trains were essential in changing the definition of time. In Switzerland, as in many other places, individual cities used to keep separate times. They all had their own time. But with the advent of trains, especially in continental Europe, trains went fast enough between cities that they had to coordinate and keep the same time. So it was really trains that caused the coordination of time, certainly in Europe. And Einstein thought about electricity and magnetism and came up with his special theory of relativity, which said that time is strange. It's not universal. That time depends upon you and what you're doing. And the example he gave was a train. So go to the next slide. So don't press yet. So this is one of his famous examples, just to give you a sense of how weird it is. So yeah, actually you can press once, just once, okay, Natalia? There we go, just don't do anything else. So let's say you're a conductor on that train, going through the train, and you want to synchronize, you have clocks throughout the train, and you walk throughout the train and make sure all the clocks are synchronized, so they're all going around like that, okay? And they are synchronized. But if the train is going very fast and you're on the ground looking at that train, you can press again, Natalia, once, there we go. You'll see something very different. First of all, the train will be shorter, but we won't go into that right now. But secondly, what's really weird is the clocks won't be synchronized. The clock in the front of the train will be ahead of the clock behind the train. And so for an observer on the train, things that are instantaneous, that are simultaneous at the front and back of the train, are no longer simultaneous for someone on the ground. And it's really weird that one person's before can be another person's after. If the events are far enough apart, I can say event A happens before event B, and you can say event B happens before event A, and we're both right. For events that are taking place away from either of us, where we are, we always know what's happening. But if we try and assess what the time is, if I try and test what the time is in your audience, then, of course, for me, it'll seem like a minute, and this talk will seem like it's 10 hours long for you. But that's a different kind of time. That's just perception of time. But for different observers, distant events can have different orders. So suddenly, time is relative, okay? Now, but he made it even stranger because he said, well, not only does time depend on the motion of objects, but time depends upon where you are, literally. If you're in a gravitational field, which we all are, our clocks tick at a different rate than if we're not in a gravitational field. And this was extremely strange but it meant you could measure it. And if you click once, okay, and then click again, tell you. Okay, this is where I used to have my office. This is the Jefferson Physics Lab at Harvard. And if you look at there, you see a little shack on the top. And that was actually built for this experiment by Robert Pound and his assistant Rebke in the I think it was early 1960s. They did an amazing experiment. If you just click once and then click one more time, actually, and then click one more time, we'll get all of them. Okay. What Pound realized was, well, if he put a clock on top of the Harvard Physics Building and had a clock on the bottom of the Harvard Physics Building, they're separated. The one at the top of the Harvard Physics Building is farther away from the center of the Earth than the one at the bottom. So they're experiencing different gravitational fields by a very small amount. Although this is unintelligible here, they differ by the gravitational, the effect that Einstein suggested would be there was 1 part in 10 to the 15th, a millionth of a billion. So when one clock clicked 1 second, the other would click 1 second, but off by a millionth of a second. You never think you'd be able to measure that. But they did, because they were able to send a careful, we call it a laser nowadays, up from the basement. And lasers are like clocks, because the light has a frequency. And well, in this case, it was actually a light that came from a radioactive decay, a very specific frequency, and a decay of iron. And in those days, the way they communicated was by telephone from the top of the physics building to the bottom, because there was no internet. And what happened was they're able to show that the frequency of light that was emitted by the decay of iron in the bottom, when it got to the top, had changed by exactly the amount that Einstein predicted. And similarly, they did it in the other direction. And I could go into that if you want, but I'm not going to. But it was an amazing discovery, because it meant that suddenly time was not universal in any sense. If you're at a higher altitude, your clocks are different, and if you're at a lower altitude, your clocks are different as well. And the fact that became an aspect of general relativity which changed everything, because it put time and space on the same footing. And that meant time was even stranger. Because if space and time, which are the fundamental variables of general relativity, are the same, how come I can come to London and back and do a round trip in space, but not a round trip in time? Why can't I go to the future and back, or to the past and back? Because if space and time are the same, I should be able to do that. And in fact, general relativity says you should be able to do it. Because general relativity, it's really simple, and it's a simple equation. There's left-hand side equals right-hand side. Okay, everyone gets that part? Okay, and the left-hand side is the geometry of space, and the right-hand side is the energy and momentum of the stuff in space. Now, if I want to create a geometry of space and time that allows time travel, I can, as long as I can write it down mathematically, then there must be a kind of energy that I can write down mathematically on the right-hand side that will produce that kind of space. Because space and time are determined by the configuration of matter and energy within. So mathematically, I can always write down a space where there's time travel. And then it implies what kind of energy I need to produce that. Now the key question is, can you produce that kind of energy? Okay? And the answer is, we don't know. It's one of the first we don't know questions. And as I said in my book, I don't know is the most important 3 words in science, and it should be the most important 3 words in society. Much of the current culture wars and everything else would disappear if people weren't so certain that they know the truth before you even ask the questions. But we don't know. And time travel is still therefore an open question. When I wrote my book, The Physics of Star Trek, my late friend Stephen Hawking wrote the foreword for it, and he had said that time travel was impossible. And he gave a very good argument. He said if time travel were possible, we'd already be inundated by tourists from the future. You know, in fact, he actually even held a party and invited time travelers. Okay? No one showed up. Okay? So he said time travel was impossible. And I countered him, however, by saying that they all went back to the 1960s and no one noticed. And so he had to change his mind. But what is amazing to me is it's an open question at the forefront of science. We don't know that time travel is impossible. And if it is possible, you know a host of paradoxes result. And that's why most physicists hope that time travel isn't possible in a sense. But as I've said many times, the universe doesn't exist to make us happy. And maybe time travel is possible. And we have to change our notions, maybe even of cause and effect. Because it's nature that gets to determine what's sensible, not us. Okay? Now, when I talk to people about this and I see their eyes glaze over, as some of yours are, I want to point out that people often ask, since the science I do, and not like some of the other science you're going to hear about, I'm very proud of the fact that the science I do has absolutely no practical significance whatsoever. Okay? Because it's a unfortunate aspect in some sense in my mind that science produces technology. It's not unfortunate, it allows us all to be here and many of us be alive when we wouldn't be alive otherwise. But suddenly, because science produces technology, for many people science becomes equivalent to technology. And then people say, of what use is this, right? If it doesn't produce a faster car, a better toaster, why worry about weird aspects of clocks in space or the beginning of the universe or the end? And the point is that the real beauty of science, the magic of reality, as a good friend of mine in the back put it once, is the fact that it's the ideas that come from science. That's what makes it so beautiful, the fact that it changes our perspective of our place in the cosmos. And so that's why we should celebrate, because science keeps opening our mind by showing us what we don't know, and by provoking questions, not answers. By provoking questions, and that's the key aspect of science, which I may get to in a bit. But for those people who nevertheless are of a practical bent, I should point out, go to the next slide, that this abstract aspect of general relativity, that clocks change when they're high up and down, every one of you, I certainly used it today to get here. Actually, my taxi driver did, but same thing. Okay, every one of you uses a GPS, usually on a daily basis. Well, the satellites in a GPS they're moving very fast, and because they're moving very fast to the ground, the way a GPS works is quite simple. You have a bunch of satellites with atomic clocks. You receive the signals from 2 or 3 of them, and you find out how long it took for the signal to go to you from the clocks. And the time travel tells you, since light travels at the speed of light, you work out by 3 clocks, you can triangulate where you are by finding out how long it took for each of those signals to get to you. But that requires that all the clocks be synchronized. But they're moving because they're in orbit. So their clocks are traveling, in fact, slower than a clock on the ground, at least as measured on the ground. But it's even worse. They're at an altitude of maybe 12,000, 14,000, 24,000 miles above the Earth's surface. So they're at a different place in the gravitational field. You can calculate that because of the effects of general relativity, the clocks will change by about 43 microseconds within a few hours because of the fact, compared to a clock on the ground. And if you work out how fast light travels, within about 10 minutes, you'd be a kilometer wrong. If we didn't build into this and take into account the fact that these clocks are traveling at a different rate, or ticking at a different rate than the clock on the ground. So every one of you was able to use GPS and not get lost in 10 minutes a kilometer away from where you thought you'd be, precisely because we take into account the fact that time does change. So that abstract thing actually is about as useful as anything technologically, because it allows us to get around for now and then. So, but we still don't know the key questions like, will time end? How did time begin? And can we go back and forward in time? Those are things I talk about in the book and talk about those open questions. But time is perhaps the most personal and most direct. I begin my book with it because time, for all of us, is perhaps the most personal thing we experience, the tragedy of time, the tragedy that we're all moving forward in the future and can't go back to either correct our errors or relive them, depending upon our mood. Next slide. I don't know if I ended. The thing about black holes, these by the way are called Penrose diagrams after Roger Penrose, who invented them. It's a way of thinking about the future and the past. And I don't want to go into explaining it, but what's really neat, one of the crazy things about black holes, and we don't know a lot about what happens inside black holes, we'd like to find out, but one of the strange things is, this is the future. We call this the light cone, because nothing can travel faster than light. So, and in this frame of reference, light travels at 45 degrees. So this is your future. Everything you can ever see will be in that light cone. And what's really weird is when you go inside of a black hole, all the light cones start pointing directly at the singularity at the center. And that means space becomes like time. Because no matter what you do, space always moves. No matter what you put in, you try and put in your gas on, you're in the car, you're trying to go that way, you always move inexorably towards a singularity. And so space becomes like time, and it turns out time becomes like space. So the two things flip when you're inside a black hole, and that is remarkable. One of the very strange things about black holes, because this is the most extreme place that gravity is important. And of course, the key question is, what happens here? Because space ends, does time end? Or does it go to a different universe? All of these are open questions at the forefront of physics, and one of the things that many people like me have been paid to worry about. Okay, let's go to the next topic, which is much closer to the many of you, and to some of the other things we're going to hear about. I want to talk about life. Okay, next. I think I have a quote. Oh yeah, from, I think, Sartre. Everything has been figured out except how to live. And that certainly seems to be the case more and more every day. Let's just go to the next slide. There's so many aspects of life. And people may wonder why a physicist would talk about life. There's a long history of physicists talking about life. I mean, the first one is really Carl Sagan. He did it in terms of the apple pie. He said, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. It's the first part of the recipe. Usually it's left out of the books, but it's there. It's inherently true. Well, the same thing is true about life. If you're thinking about life, you have to ultimately start thinking about the universe in which life exists. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But there's even a longer connection between physics and the development of the understanding of the origin of life and, in fact, genetics. If you go to the next slide. A very important book was written by Ernst Schrödinger, who helped develop quantum mechanics, called What is Life? In 1946. It was incredibly influential, and it influenced a generation of people who became fundamental biologists. James Watson was going to be an ornithologist, and he read What is Life by Schrödinger and got quite interested in the question that ultimately led him and Crick to discover the nature of DNA. Crick was trained as a physicist. Max Delbruck, who was another major biologist, trained as a physicist. There's a long history of physics involved in understanding the key questions of life. Now, if we can go to the next slide. The thing I want to mention here, because it's relevant to the crowd that's here, is how you will hear people tell you that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and that's existence for God. Okay? And it is remarkable to me that people will still say that. Well, a lot of things are remarkable to me that people still say. But because we already have the example from Darwin of exactly why that statement is wrong. And so let me just give you, go to the next slide. This is a brief history of time. And I don't have time to do it adequately, to describe it adequately. Time goes in this direction. The galaxies are here, the Big Bang's here. There's a period early on called inflation where our universe blew up by an immense factor in a very short time. And as I say, I had a bunch of slides to show about this. I certainly talk about it in the book. And that turns out to be give us a natural explanation of why the universe looks the way it does. But there's another consequence. It also tells us that actually the part of space that's our universe is really a small part of all of space. Most of space is still expanding so fast, much faster than you can imagine. What happens in an inflationary universe is space starts to expand and it never stops expanding. Small droplets, like raindrops, decouple from that expansion, so-called pocket universes, and in them, and there's a Big Bang. At least in our universe, there was a Big Bang. Our universe, you can think of time beginning when it decoupled in some sense from inflation. And the amazing thing that says, though, that space is much, much bigger. And I had a great quote from, of course, none other than Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it's a wonderful, space is so big that you probably remember the quote from Douglas Adams. It's makes a trip to the chemist seem like nothing, or something like that. But it's even worse. At the time he wrote that, he had no idea that space is actually much bigger than just the space we see. And if that's true, then it could be there are other regions of that space which are only now decoupling from inflation, and in which a Big Bang is occurring there. But it also turns out that just like when you have raindrops and you look at the raindrops that freeze and become snowflakes, and you look at the snowflakes in a microscope, all the snowflakes are different. They're beautiful, but they all look different. And it turns out, it's quite possible, if you go to the next slide, our current picture of the universe is more like this, that there are regions that decouple from inflation, and the laws of physics are what we measure them to be. In other universes, the laws of physics, when you decouple from inflation, it turns out the forces and nature of what the forces could be different. In those universes, there may be no galaxies. This is very depressing if you grew up when I grew up, because I grew up wanting to be a physicist so I could figure out why the universe was the way it is, and had to be the way it is. But of course, if this is true, it means most of the time the universe is totally different. You just happen to find out yourself in a universe like ours, and then galaxies are in it. Well, that gives the fact that there are many universes and the laws of physics can be different in each of them should remind you of the fact that there are many different life forms. And even within a given life form, there's a diversity in a population in the nature of the genes in that population. And that suggests something else. So when it comes to the universe. So if you go to the next slide, which I hope will be, okay. It turns out, as I say, these are many different universes that are forming, and physicists and other people can only live in one of these parts of the multiverse. And if that's true, then you see it really is the case that even if it's true in just a single universe, it says that life is not fine-tuned, that the universe isn't fine-tuned for life, but rather the other way around. So if you go to the next slide, which I think will have the statement I want to say. And this is what everyone should automatically recognize. People once thought the earth was created for life, right? But we now know that the diversity of the life we see on the earth is not because the earth was specially created for it, but only those life forms that can survive in a given environment are around. The beauty of nature that Richard has described so beautifully in so many of his books, the apparent architecture of life forms that are diverse and seemingly miraculous are just due to the fact that they are fine-tuned by natural selection and evolution to be able to exist in their environment. We live in our universe because we can live in it. There's nothing profound or sacred in that notion. Okay? It would be like, an intelligent fish would ask, why is the universe made of water? And the answer was, well, if it wasn't, the intelligent fish wouldn't be around to ask the question. And when we realize that now there can be many universes with different laws of physics in them, then it becomes even a more interesting question. This is still true in our universe. We evolved on Earth because the Earth happened to be in a relatively quiescent part of our galaxy, and many things happened so we could be here. But we don't know if we're alone in the universe, and we don't know what kinds of life can form. In a multiverse, it's even more remarkable. Because in a multiverse where there are different laws of physics, you might find yourself with completely different life forms, asking exactly why that universe was so finely tuned for life in that universe. And this was brought home for me, if you go to the next slide. In one of, Richard and I talked about this recently in a dialogue we did. I think it's both of our favorite science fiction books ever, by Fred Hoyle, the great British science writer and astronomer, cosmologist. This is, you should read this book. It's an amazingly, it's just a wonderful bit of science fiction, and captures in some ways, accurately the way science is done, in a way that many of them don't. But what is interesting about this particular book is that there is a life form that's a black cloud in space. It eventually turns out to be something that has intelligence, as different as you could possibly be. And when we think about life forms and what's possible, then anything's possible because we don't know. We know of one example of life based on DNA and ATP and all the rest. We don't know what the possibilities are for life. I've ever bet with Richard, by the way, that I happen to think any other life discovered in the universe will probably have exactly the same chemistry. That's my bet. Because I think it's probably the laws of physics and chemistry combined that probably there's one direction that produces effective life forms. And I'd love to be wrong, but that's my bet. And Richard is not so sure. But if there are vastly different kinds of life, then once again, they can live in vastly different kinds of places. And the universe will seem to them, or their local surroundings will seem to be them to be fine-tuned. So the illusion of tuning, the illusion of design, which Darwin destroyed so effectively in life, is still true for the universe. And when someone tells you the universe is fine-tuned for life, it's not. In fact, most of the universe wants to kill us on a daily basis, and one day will. And most of the universe is pretty inhospitable. In fact, so there's no sense in which the universe is fine-tuned for life, and that argument that is exploited all the time now in a new book by another design person just came out about that. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, I have no idea how, I'm going to try and, can you go, sorry, I'm looking at this because I want you to go, Okay, next. Is the last part of the book, which is the most difficult part of the book for me, but in some sense, the most remarkable. I move from time to space to matter to life to consciousness. Because consciousness is difficult. I've said on stage numerous times, and people think I'm joking, that I do physics because it's easy. But it is. Compared to consciousness, physics is just easy. Because we can do a lot of physics, but we can't even define consciousness. It's really hard to define, and you can go, I don't know if I have a quote from it, so click. Oh, this was a great quote from Erwin Schrödinger. I think it's a really important quote. Consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. Because we don't know. We know most of us are conscious. Most of us. And we are sure we have some consciousness. But what does it mean? And are other things conscious? Well, I just was on an event actually that was in England, but I was remote, that me and Noam Chomsky were together, and he was talking about a book. And we both agree that we think our dogs are conscious. And not everyone thinks that. I think Dad Dennett doesn't think that, but he's wrong. But we don't know. And the problem is we can't ask our dog. We can do it by observing behavior. If you click the next slide, behavior is really, keep clicking until you get to it. Okay. Keep going. So protozoa can swim away. Okay, stop there. Protozoa can swim away from harmful environments. And even bacteria give some behavioral evidence of learning and memory. But they don't have neurons. So you can't infer consciousness from behavior. And one of my favorite quotes, click once more time, is from Bertrand Russell. If you just click, okay. From the protozoa to man, there is nowhere a very wide gap, either in structure or behavior. And it's true, in structure, they're very similar, right? We share genes with most species at an incredibly high level. But even in terms of behavior, the kind of things we infer mean that people are conscious of what's going on. That behavior exists in systems which we're pretty darn sure aren't conscious. So that's a problem. Next slide. But I want to just talk about one thing here, and we're almost at the end, you please know. In our own species, you can't even trust your own perceptions of consciousness. And I want to talk about an experiment that was done that many of you may have heard of. If you go to the next one, by Michael Gazzaniga and colleagues. It's called the split brain experiment. People who have epileptic seizures, the brain has two hemispheres, and is connected by a corpus callosum that connects the two. And women, by the way, have a bigger corpus callosum than men. And what's one of the reasons my wife tells me that women can multitask better than men. I don't know if it's true, but anyway, it connects those two. And many parts of our perception is either carried out in one hemisphere or another. And it turned out that a surgery that could reduce epileptic seizures was discovered, which was cutting the corpus callosum in people with extreme epilepsy. Now, that reduced their symptoms, and it produced some side effects, but the side effects were much less bad than the symptoms, kind of like COVID vaccines, for example. But anyway, I couldn't resist. Okay, but the minute you have this, you suddenly have a laboratory, because science can work well when you when you twiddle the knobs. We can't twiddle the knobs for most people, but if in those people, their left hemisphere and their right hemisphere were disconnected. Now, the left hemisphere. The motor control of your left part of your body is controlled by the right hemisphere of your brain, and right body motor control in the left hemisphere. Similarly, your visual field. The left visual field is controlled in the right part of your brain, and the right visual field is controlled in the left hemisphere, but your speech processing is all in the left hemisphere. So what they did with those people with no corpus callosum was to put a screen so their left eye could only see one image and the right eye another. If you click keep one more time. Okay, stop there. So it's not very clear, but what they did was in the left, you would your left eye they had left side they had a snow scene, and the right side they had a chicken claw. And then they told people with their hands there was a box of stuff to do. So with the right hand, they could find something that reminded them of the scene they saw, and the left hand. And so, click one more time. Okay, so what happened? The subject would look at these two scenes and find with their right hand a chicken, and the left hand a snow shovel. The two scenes. But then they were asked why they did what they did. And remember, it's only the left hemisphere, okay, which controls speech processing, and the left visual field is controlled by the right hemisphere of your brain, okay. So the left visual field, it's controlled by the right hemisphere. So your speech doesn't know anything about that picture. And what did the person say? Click on it. When asked why they picked the chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So their hands knew what to do, what their eyes had seen, but their mind and their rationality and their consciousness told you and told them that they did something for a completely different reason than they did, but they had no awareness of this. And this is why it's so difficult to explore consciousness, because we can't be trusted for the reasons we're doing anything or the reasons we think they are. Next slide. And this is profound, okay? The verbal left brain created a coherent story of the conscious awareness that had nothing to do with what the person actually saw. It rationalized what was going on. And so trying to explore consciousness will be forever a difficult problem, because we know our own consciousness, and we all wonder when I see green, is the same green that you see, but how can we find that out? Now, next slide. Almost at the end. Okay, forget self. I don't want to talk about a sense self. I will later. Some people say it's an illusion, but my point is that who cares if it's an illusion? What matters if you're a scientist is how does that illusion arise? So philosophers can worry about whether self is an illusion, but the key question is what gives us a solution that there's a little person inside our head controlling our movements? What gives us the illusion that we have a self? And again, just like being late for that train, I can tell you that self is an illusion, but if I kick you in the shins or you're jilted by a lover, it's not going to give you much solace, okay? Okay, but on Richard Feynman's blackboard when he died, he told me a different way. He once said to me, if you can do nothing, you know nothing. But on his blackboard, when he died, there was a little phrase that said, if you can't build it, you don't understand it. And in my opinion, I think the one way that we'll eventually understand consciousness is by building consciousness, a topic that's become much in the news of late. And if you go to the next slide. You know, we're talking about ChatGPT-5, now what about ChatGPT-50? What about quantum computers? All of these concerns about what AI might eventually achieve. I'm not as concerned as many people, so let me just go on to the next slide. I want to give you an object lesson. History is, I've always enjoyed history, and history is important. As Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot. And so let's go next. Press the button. In the 9th century BC, a derivation of the Phoenician alphabet was introduced into Greece and evolved over the next few hundred years. It was viewed by many, including Plato and Socrates, as an awful thing. Writing was going to destroy storytelling. Writing was an impediment to wisdom. It did not capture the whole truth, propagated the illusion of knowledge, and would eliminate the need for memory. You wouldn't have to remember stories because you could read them. Socrates said he was suspicious of writing, arguing that written communication would never be as clear as face-to-face communication, which may be true, by the way, because one could not ask questions of a document, unless it's ChatGPT. Okay, so this was viewed as the end of wisdom, memory, and storytelling. Next slide. Okay. I think most of us who write, think that writing is a good thing, okay? AI, like writing, is a natural byproduct of human development. I don't think it's either artificial nor intelligent, certainly not yet. ChatGPT may have the answers to many of your questions, but the signal of intelligence, if you wanted to come up with it, at least in my mind, would be coming up with the good questions. That's much more in the nature of what humans would think of their own intelligence. And it's not clear to me you could ever even define if it was intelligence or where, but we can go into that question. But anyway, next. Technology, every technology we've ever had has changed the way we behave as human beings. If you'd asked 30 years ago if you'd see most people walking around looking down at a little box all the time, it wouldn't be the case. Fire changed it. Cars changed it. Sure, AI is going to change the world, but big deal. It doesn't have to be the Terminator. A world of books to read is better than a world without books. I certainly think so, and so do the booksellers who are over there right now. But yes, and next. So the AI future could be better or worse. It's up to us. I said at the end of my last book, The Physics of Climate Change, that the future is driving towards us like a freight train, but it's doing so on tracks that we have built. We get to decide. We can't determine the future, but we can help determine the directions of the future. And it may be AI will take over lots of jobs. You know, doctors, lawyers, getting rid of lawyers would not be the end of the world. But maybe we will, there are two possibilities. Giving them more free time to sit in coffee shops, read, listen to music, have good discussions, or take the people who've developed the AI and concentrate the financial resources in their offices and make the rest of us poor and homeless and starve. It's our future. Yes, I want to get to the end now. So keep going. Please. Okay. Recognizing that we don't know is the key point. Because the fact that we don't know means we need to think about it. And that can help us ensure that the future is better than the past. And this leads me to my last two slides, which is why we don't know is important in our society. So next, please go as quick as you can. Okay, forget that. It's the beginning of science. It's the beginning of science. That's the key. Okay, I want to come close to ending with a quote from my favorite science communicator, Jacob Bernowski. Did anyone see The Ascent of Man here? Anyway, it was the best, in my mind, still in my mind, the best science TV series ever. And I include Carl Sagan's series here. But as he said, dream or nightmare, we have to live our experience as it is, and we have to live it awake. We live in a world which is penetrated through and through by science, and which is both whole and real. We cannot turn it into a game simply by taking sides. And that's the lesson. Next slide. We are nowadays taking sides. The culture wars are taking sides. People are taking sides because they want to make the game of what they want to be true, true. And that's just not the way the world works. Humility and honesty demand that we be clear about the limits of our knowledge, the limitations of our knowledge. That's the lesson, when I put my book, that's the lesson I think we're all here today to talk about. To change the future, we have to understand the limits of our knowledge and not be shy about it. We should celebrate the fact that we don't know everything. It doesn't mean we know nothing. As I've often said, lack of understanding is not evidence for God or aliens or UFOs. It's evidence of lack of understanding. And that should be the invitation to learn. There remain remarkable mysteries to be uncovered. And the last slide will be next, which again is Richard Feynman. I put this up here because it's personal to me. When I was in high school, I had some science program I was in, and I was bored, and the professor came up and gave me The Character of Physical Law by Richard Feynman, and it was the first time that I read it, and I realized that it wasn't all done. You know, I'd read about Einstein, I'd read about all the other stuff, but it seemed to me like it was all done. And it was the first book that made me realize that it wasn't all done. And I took that as a personal invitation. Hey, there's a reason to be a scientist. And you know, I can't say that it will happen, but I know that when I was writing my book and when I'm speaking, my hope is that some young person will be excited by the fact that we don't know everything, be excited by the fact that the world is a mysterious place and remains a mysterious place, and that makes it more exciting, and that's an invitation to discover. It's why we should teach by questions and not answers, and we should talk to each other and understand that we may actually learn something from other people. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, eh?
Do we have time for one or two questions? Up to you.
Well, I'm afraid we don't, because we've got a packed program, other people waiting to come and speak. But I tell you what, if we ask Lawrence nicely, maybe he'd answer some questions in messages or something afterwards.
Well, I mean, I'm here for a while, but people can ask me questions.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Well, it's good that Lawrence mentioned all these dogmatic people that think they know the answers, and they are the ones that accuse us of not being humble. It's weird. Anyway, he mentioned the brain, and we've got the very person to talk about that. We have Professor Scott from the Cognitive Neuroscience Faculty of the University College of London. Yeah? And her favorite research topic is laughter.
All events happen in space and in time. And that's what makes physics so wonderful.